To my left, I have Susanna Pollack, the executive producer from Games for Change, Pierre Zandrovich, representing Atlas 5, and Michaela Ternosky-Holland, who is the impact producer and creative strategist for Games for Change, and Mike Brett, co-writer, co-director from Archer's Mark. And before asking questions, I just want to give a little context to this piece. As we sit here tonight, the threat of nuclear war is unquestionably greater than at any time since 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis. But whereas the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded over the course of 13 days, we now are almost a year into a remarkably heightened risk of the use of a nuclear weapon. And this virtual reality piece I found remarkable because it's a reminder of an issue of existential importance, but it's not didactic. It's quite poetic, and I found it incredibly powerful. So I just would like to start out asking Suzanne about Games for Change and how did you come to think of a project like this? And how do you imagine games that just don't rely on shooting other people and racing cars?
Well, thank you, Eric. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to Carl and the entire MOMI team for supporting this installation. It is our first museum exhibition in the United States, and so excited to have it in my hometown of New York. So Games for Change is a non-for-profit, and we do a lot of things, but in terms of supporting a community of practice that's using games and immersive media to drive real-world impact. And when this project, or the idea for this project came to us, it didn't originate, internally. It actually came to us from an academic, Dr. Alex Glazer from Princeton University, and then PhD candidate Tamara Patton, who had the idea of creating some form of interactive experience that would elevate the conversation around nuclear weapons. Now, this was in 2015, I think it was. So, we're talking quite a few years ago, and before, two administrations ago, right? And part of what we do with organizations or institutions is help them strategize what kind of interactive media would serve an impact goal that they have. In this case, it was elevating the conversation about nuclear weapons, appealing to a younger generation, and starting a different kind of conversation that would connect with them in a way that research has shown, and I guess recent history has shown, is presenting nuclear weapons as an existential threat, as a geopolitical strategy, is frightening and is overwhelming and often pushes people away to want to get engaged. So they knew that they wanted to find some kind of way to have a connection with people, and so they would truly care. As we talked through it, we realized that virtual reality would provide the opportunity for that kind of emotional connection and building empathy around the topic. But it wasn't until we met the people at Archer's Mark and Atlas 5 that we really honed in on the story of Hawaii. And it turned out to be quite a coincidence because Tamara Patton, who is featured in the piece, was a PhD candidate, had family in Hawaii, and that was her home. And she shared with us the story, and I remember her telling us a story, and Mike, you can say more, but you were like, this is it. Like, this is a way to get people to connect. It's something that could impact all of us. And we realized that was the way in to this otherwise, overwhelming topic.
And Pierre and Mike, I want to talk to you about the creation of this, and then Michaela, I want to ask you about how do you get a project like this into the world, and how will it work even making an impact with something like this. And I want everyone here to realize that, this is not virtual reality of Hiroshima. So it's not a horrific experience to see. It's an oddly beautiful meditation on the possibility of nuclear war. And Pierre, what is your background in virtual reality, and how long have you been engaged in it, and what drew you to it as a way of expressing not just ideas but creating art?
Well, I think I started VR 8 years ago, when it was like the whole new beginning of that technology. And I have a background in film, but when I discovered VR, the first steps of it was 360 films. So it means you can't really walk in the experience, you can just look around and you can't really interact. And then I discovered new tools to create these kind of experiences, which means you can, walk around and even touch things. And so the challenge here on the morning you wake was to create something that wasn't too artificial, because the tools we're using are mostly tools from video games. So you can have this kind of artificial way of looking at things, and so this is why we try to make it as human as possible. And we work with that technology called volumetric capture, and this is how I circle back with filmmaking in a way, because we had to actually shoot in a studio with real humans. It wasn't only like 3D people. So it was a really nice mix between 3D and being on a set with real people. So I was, with that project, in a way, we came back to filmmaking within the virtual environment. But I guess you can.
And I have one more question. I'm just curious, now that you're, years into it, where do you see the potential for VR, and has it been reached, or where do you see it going from, for example, what this project is?
Well, it's really hard to tell because technology goes so fast. But I would say that we could achieve, like I would say, in the 6 or 7 years, we could be actually in a film, because when you watch On the Morning You Wake, you're still in the 3D environment, and I think that with AI, VR, and all the technology that we never heard of yet, we will be able to walk in an actual, almost real life environment. So it means, in a way, I feel like our work is in between, is at crossroad between cinema, theater, and video game. And On the Morning You Wake is really there, and I think the medium is going to evolve in that direction. So I don't have all the answers, but here's a glimpse of it.
And Mike, I mean, you've made documentaries and feature films, and On the Morning You Wake has a classic 3-act structure. And I'm wondering, for you as a filmmaker, where is the overlap between VR and filmmaking, and how much more challenging was this than other films that you worked on?
Loads more challenging, but I think you make a really good point there about overlap and also about bringing new technologies into this process. So I think you need to be really aware that not to get too excited by the shiny things, because there's so many lovely, exciting, technologically innovative tools at your fingertips now as a creator. And I think it's very easy to be drawn to those things just for innovation's sake. And I think that was never the root of this story. I think Suzanne has obviously mentioned that Tamara and her experience and the messages that she received from friends and family were a way into this. And the first part of the process was not to sit down there with a spreadsheet of massive computers and volumetric capture ideas and point cloud art direction. It was actually to speak to people. We spent nearly 9 to 12 months just interviewing people and getting their testimonies and starting to build that 3-act structure you talked about. we had dozens and dozens and dozens of hours of testimony. Thank you, Michaela, and Erin and Susanna for accommodating some of those things in the exhibition out there. But it was, I think, what was so rich about the story was that it wasn't just a simple script on the page. It was drawn from dozens and dozens of hours of people's testimony, and that, in the same way that we do with Notes on Blindness, that sort of super analog foundation actually is where the real heart and soul, I think, of the story lies. And then it was a question of, well, now we have this structure, now we have, and obviously in conjunction with our co-writer Jamaica, who you heard at the start of this, had this really beautiful lyrical 3-act structure with this sort of thread interweaving in the context, obviously, of the history of nuclear testing in the Pacific, which was so critical to people's experience on the day. We then had to work out how on earth we're going to visualize that thing, right? And I think the thing that's different from filmmaking is, if you write down your vision as a filmmaker, you actually know the tools that you're working with, and you know what constraints you're working within. It's quite unusual to be told by a technician in France that the 4-person scene that you wrote now has to have 3 people in it because the headset can't handle that amount of data. And I think there are a lot of those kind of technical challenges. No one has ever, for context, no one has ever made what is effectively a feature-length narrative piece using the amount of volumetric capture that we did. So we had this brilliant consumer level headset, but the problem is you want to reach a lot of people, you have to put it in a cheaper headset. You put it in a cheaper headset, you don't have the same processing power. If you don't have the same processing power, you can't have the same flows of data. So you're constrained from the minute that you're starting. So I think that creative constraints can be really useful. And actually, I think there's nothing more powerful to me in this experience than when you're standing in Mitsuko's kitchen and she's telling you about her experience in Hiroshima. You don't need car crashes or explosions or any of these sort of pyrotechnics. But some of that was dictated by the technology as well as our own sort of taste, and like you say, the design not to exploit or otherwise sort of make a spectacle of the nuclear threat. That was very important to us. It was rooted in that sort of soulful experience as well.
Well, I'm not just being polite, but I've seen an enormous amount of virtual reality, and this is one of my favorite pieces. And the other one that I've mentioned to you guys on the phone the other day is a piece I saw called "We Live in an Ocean of Air," and it was incredibly beautiful. It took you to such a beautiful world that when your time was up, you didn't want to leave. But the difference between these two pieces is that one was unscripted, and it allowed you to just travel and wander in this incredibly beautiful imaginary world, and yet On the Morning You Wake is scripted with a 3-act structure. And do you see VR increasingly going in that direction, sort of like filmmaking or the theater, but just using a whole different set of tools to add to the experience? Because with that scripted, there's this authorial presence, whereas in other VR pieces I've seen there isn't. It's almost like a work of art that you can wander in.
It's a great question. Shall I take
No,
it? I think it's a great question. I think you've raised loads of questions about authorship, control. For us, I think the medium is the message completely, right? Well, when you're a storyteller, you should be thinking not how this is my medium, this is the story. Let's jam those two things together, regardless of the relationship between the two. You should be thinking, what is the format in which the story that I am trying to tell best lives? And I think that there was no doubt in our mind when we heard the story about a virtual nuclear attack, that inhabiting that space was incredibly important to actually feeling, both on an emotional and a cognitive level, what it would be like to receive a message saying incoming ballistic missile alert. So for us, it was a bit of a no-brainer that this was the right execution of that. I think it hits differently when you are in the space, when you yourself receive the message, when you can move around and be with those who are in the same time frame that they're actually receiving it as well. So to your question about what is the direction of VR, I don't think it's as simple as is that area going to become more scripted. I think VR itself is evolving incredibly fast. I think even what we've seen here with the supplementary materials living around the experience in the headset, we have a version of this which is projection mapped. And so actually you don't have to wear a headset and you can experience it communally with a number of people, which again is something that's super important to us, which is how you bring audiences together.
And that's what I wanted to ask Michaela about.
Yeah.
Michaela, one of the challenges is that the power of VR is that you're taken into this whole other world, but there's something also isolating about it. And so in trying to use this to kind of create a collective action, how do you meet the challenge of something that's such an individual experience and turning it into a collective discussion and then maybe something that people do something about?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, just like how we, in the piece itself with the creative, they approach the experience from the more human perspective of nuclear weapons threat and not the material perspective of nuclear weapons threat. I, as an impact producer, and the work I've been doing with Games for Change is approaching the idea of quality over quantity. I think a lot of times when we think about creating impact, we think about how many people can we get in the door, how many millions of people are going to see this experience, and really, I think what we've really leaned into is the quality of experience somebody can have when they come and see On the Morning You Wake. And so we've really focused in on this idea of wraparound materials. So it's a lot of times when I've created VR and I've produced VR, I find it lacks a lot when you get into headset and you get out of headset. And you don't really have an understanding of like, why did I get into the headset in the first place? Like, why am I getting out of headset now? And so what we built off of these amazing pieces and chapters that Trustmark and Atlas VIA collaborated on is these wraparound materials where we onboard you gently into the idea of nuclear weapons threat. We onboard you gently into the idea of doing VR. Once you're in VR, the way that we train our staff is really important to me because, like you said, it's such an intimate experience. So thinking about that idea of you can have the most amazing hotel, but if you have a really rude concierge, that kind of ruins your experience, right? So I can have the most amazing VR experience that I've been gifted basically by these amazing creators. But if my staff and who's putting you in headset doesn't give you the most human, non-assuming, wherever you are as a digital native or non-digital native person, putting you in headset may or may not be really intimidating for you. It may not be really comfortable for you. Trying to make sure we break that boundary of that uncomfortability to find intimacy and to find care through our experience. And that care continues on into the after experience, which we call aftercare, which is another part of what we do. Sometimes it changes and adjusts based on the audience we have. So what's really beautiful is when you create digital assets, they're very flexible. So sometimes we localize those assets specifically to the region we're a part of. So we've localized those assets into Norwegian when we were in Oslo. We've also localized the call to actions based on where we are. So sometimes when we're in Vienna at the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, we're doing a more specific call of action to the policy that's happening around people. So we keep it really engaging for our audience because we're constantly thinking about what speaks to that audience. And I think one of my favorite parts of the aftercare survey is that it asks you what you're interested in. Are you interested in racism? Are you interested in LGBTQIA? Are you interested in nuclear weapons policy? Are you interested in art and nuclear weapons? And then based on the selection you make as a person, your survey connects you to an organization working directly in that field. And then from there we ask, hey, do you want us to text you that organization? So we're really thinking about not just the digital expansion of VR, but the digital expansion of all the other mediums we have with digital technology. Surveys, text messaging, emails. They might seem like, oh, everybody's doing them, but I don't think it's about not doing it the same as everybody else. It's about doing them with the authenticity of voice and care that I think at Games for Change is really important to us, and in this project is really important to the creators as well.
And one question, so in the VR that you've produced, you know, how does the length vary, and how often is it scripted? I mean, was this 45 minutes? How long was this?
It was meant to be 38 minutes, but I think it got to about 36.
Okay.
38 minutes being the duration of the alarm.
Yeah, and how long what's the longest VR that?
45 minutes.
This is long. This is asking a lot of people.
Most of them are around, most of them are more around 20 minutes, I would say. But yeah, the longest are more
And is that a financial restriction, or is that something about being in that world for that long?
Okay. No, I think, do you know what? It's really, really interesting. Since we did Notes and Blindness in 2016,
How long was that?
that was about 18 minutes, I think, 20 minutes. That was considered a really long duration for a VR project back in 2016. And the majority of things that were screening at Sundance at the same time, some of them were like 3-4 minutes. They almost felt like demos to us. But I think that a lot of that is speaks to people's exposure to VR, their level of comfort with VR, their literacy with VR as well. And I think that there was a sense that like anything too long is going to scare people off this medium. And I think now we have a much more mature audience. People like Michaela and Erin and Suzanne are also creating environments where it's easier for people to get in. I think it's fantastic when you walk up and you see the art direction, the environment, you feel like you're being eased into it, not just being dumped into an anonymous headset and hoping you can escape and you don't know how long it's going to take. And I think now for us, the sophistication of audiences justifies the kind of duration of this experience. And it also is really liberating as a filmmaker, as a creator, to be allowed to tell stories of that length and sophistication, which can have a 3-act structure that can take you on a journey rather than sort of, you shoot a few things or something that's a huge spectacle that you haven't seen before. A lot of earlier VR things felt more novelty, I think, than really sophisticated storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, and do you think it's analogous to the history of cinema, where the early films were just a few minutes long, and people were afraid when they saw a train coming towards them in a theater, but eventually wound up with 5 or 6 hour documentaries that.
I'm not sure, because when you're in a VR experience, it's really like it gets into you way more than a film, I think, because it's funny, because the first question I'm asking every time I'm watching a VR experience is, why am I here? And this is not a question you ask when you watch a film. You're just curious.
It's a really lousy film sometimes.
Yeah, but like in VR, you are there, and you're like your presence is there. Like
Yeah.
So it's it can be really like too powerful in a way to stay more than 40 minutes or 45 minutes. Like, yeah.
Can I just add that I think a lot of it is context, right? So this film can be broken up in chapters, and we have shown it in chapters in other places where the audience, there's not an expectation that an audience will sit there and it is comfortable to sit there for as long as as the full piece allows, which obviously is the original intention, is that somebody will sit and watch and feel, and go through the emotional journey of this 3-act structure. And I think that's what's honestly terrific about showing the piece in this context, in a museum that's about the moving image, where people are used to coming in and watching a film, obviously much longer than this experience, but are prepared and ready to sit and be in this space for nearly 40 minutes. And
I stood. I mean, I don't know how often people do that, but I walked. I made you create a boundary in your room so you don't walk into the wall. But then I physically moved around in space, and it was really cool.
Yeah, as an impact producer, it's so great that it's broken up into chapters, because oftentimes I'll get people come to me who want to showcase the piece, but they're like, no one's going to sit for 45 minutes. We just don't have that time in our event. We just don't have time in blank. I'll be like, great, we have a chapter 1, takes 20 minutes. Jump in, they can get a sense of it. If they're interested, it's available on the Quest 2 for free. They can complete it if they get access to a Quest 2. And oftentimes, when we're thinking about accessibility, it's also buy-in. VR is very much about a buy-in moment. Like, you can't just say like, oh, it'll just be a film that plays on a TV screen. There's so much that goes into it for the venue. There's so much that goes into it for the staff, the setup, the breakdown. And so oftentimes when I'm thinking about buy-in, usually I say, well, chapter 1's a great option, but we also always offer chapters 1 through 3. And 80% of the time, my colleague Erin, who's probably here, can also attest, most people will only watch chapter 1 and slowly come back to watch chapters 2 and 3. They're like, oh, do you think, is there time? Can I just watch the rest of it? Because it does hook you like that. But it's great to have the option. And I think that's important to allow people to feel like they have the ability to make the choice versus forcing them into an idea of what they should be doing.
And you had mentioned how powerful VR can be. And for me, oddly enough, the power of VR is most analogous to the power of theater at its best. And theater is the least technologically dependent when it's really working in VR. The other thing about VR is it's like you can't check your email in the middle of it. You're either in it or you're out of it. And I don't know. I mean, I wonder whether there will be 2-3 hour scripted VR that just, once people become used to the technology and feel comfortable with it, I mean, it certainly seems, and not this piece as much, it really seems like a good way to just scare the crap out of people. I mean, really, I could think of all kinds of ways with that technology to do it. And this doesn't scare you in any kind of cheap way. There's an unsettling quality.
I want to talk a bit about comfort actually, because it's a discomfort is a word that Jamaica uses a lot when she speaks about this experience, and I think it's really important. Well, I think there's one thing you say about duration is really interesting, which is what I think sort of the revolution of streaming and so on has done is it's actually changed our expectations of the durations. People are not just having to hit certain slots for broadcasters, right?
Yeah.
And so, and the same goes for the duration of movies these days. But you might have 45 episodes in a series, or you might have 10, 50-minute episodes. Like the concept of duration is sort of elastic, and it allows you to fit choose the right duration for the content you're making. And I think for this project, yes, 40 minutes is a big ask. We're asking you to make yourself uncomfortable. We're asking you to put yourself into a different mindset, and that also sort of speaks to the use of interaction as well, because this isn't a game, but it was built in a game engine, and what it gives you is a lot of really powerful tools that make you reflect on your own agency, which is an incredibly important thing to reflect about when you're thinking about nuclear weapons, because you do feel powerless, you do feel frustrated. If you could play a game where you can press a button, or you could call the US president and say, don't press the button, or you had any influence over the events that were unfolding in front of you, you would not understand the nuclear threat that you face.
No.
Whereas if you are sitting there thinking, well, this is terrible for all these people in Hawaii, and then you receive a text message, the buzzer goes off in your hand, and you read it, and you understand that you are part of this story, and you have to inhabit that story with them, that places you in a completely different place. We're not trying to stress people out, we're not trying to make it an unpleasant thing, but I think that duration and interaction and space are all things that you can play with depending on the subject matter and the story that you're trying to tell.
Yeah. And when you see the credits of a Marvel film, at the end there are like 5,000 people in really small font
Who do all the work?
because of the number of people who have to create all the special effects. And this didn't have a credit roll, but I mean, to create this sort of VR, how big of a technical staff is required? Or
There is a roller, and we did give them
I'm
love.
looking at them right now.
No, we did give them some love. I do want to say there is a roller at the end of chapter 3, and they all
understood
there.
that.
But yeah, maybe you can.
I would say 50 people, at least a little more maybe.
Yeah, we had an amazing team in France who we worked with previously on Notes of Blood, who are absolutely incredible technologists. It's a funny experience as a filmmaker working with technologists. That's a different experience, different dynamic, and there's a lot of no's, which I think is really hard, right? Because if you're in the edit, I mean, yeah, sure, you might be told that you can't, explode a vehicle in post-production if you're making a movie, but fundamentally you understand the tools you're working with. Whereas there were times where we basically had to say, can someone get on the phone to Microsoft and get them to write a new piece of code? Because at the moment we can't fit the right number of characters into this scene. So we were literally laying the track while the train was going.
Yeah.
So I can't speak highly enough of the team who turned their nose into yeses at our behest, and worked incredibly hard to, for example, I was speaking to a friend earlier about the art direction, and we always wanted to have this kind of atomic art direction based on these particle-based, point cloud art direction, where you understand that you're in this liminal space created by all these atomic particles, where there's a possibility of attack, but you also see these vertices, these kind of triangular pieces moving around, and that was partly an aesthetic choice, and that was partly a practical choice, which is how many points do you want in your scene? Because the more points you've got, the less data you have to put anything else into it. So you've got a pretty empty environment if you want this to be point cloud. So we worked with the team, we created a new art direction, we were able to use those vertices to create more sort of geometric spaces, tables, walls, floors, to give that shape. But it was an amazing collaboration. I think direction is a completely different thing when you're working in a space where the form itself is changing in the process of making. You cannot have that old school, ridiculous sort of idea of, as director as omniscient, omnipotent, and I think that's a damaging dynamic anyway. And this was a really collaborative process with everyone.
Well, since I have you guys, I'm just sort of curious. For each of you, what was the first VR you saw, and which is the one that's left aside from this piece that really had the greatest impact for you?
The first VR piece I saw was a 360 film in Los Angeles in 2016, and it was a piece about hunger in Africa. The piece that has stayed with me the most that I've seen is Carne Arena, which is the piece that Alejandro Inarritu did.
Yeah.
The piece itself asks you to walk around barefoot, and the barefoot is very key because there's like a pebble and dirt on the ground, and the piece is about a group of immigrants or migrants who are trying to cross the U.S. border, and they get very traumatically stopped by Border Patrol, and you kind of are a witness of that.
I heard about it but did not see it. Was that scripted, or was that just an immersive world that you entered?
It was scripted. Yeah, so it was like very similar to On the Morning Awake. It was like on rails, and you were just an observer of the experience.
And how long was that, if you remember?
It's about, well, so very similar to what we do. No, just kidding. Their whole onboarding is totally different than ours, but it's actually like 3 different physical spaces you enter into. So the onboarding in the first space is a very like cold environment where they put immigrants once they get them. And so you're there, and then you're in the VR itself. The VR itself is about 18 minutes long. And then there's an aftercare space, which is like a beautiful hallway of like images of folks who have actually crossed the border, that this was like a collaboration of their stories into a conglomeration of these characters. So it was a really beautifully like physical space you wandered through. So from top to bottom, it took me about 35 minutes. VR itself is 18.
And Suzanne?
Well, I had a very different experience with VR. I'm pretty sure I was at a games event. I was at E3, which is a big video game, convention. And it was an Aliens, like first-person shooter VR experience, of which I lasted like 15 seconds. I mean, it was so jarring. I was like, okay, but I got it at that point. And I loved the concept of being, and I just couldn't handle that, and the amount of input, and I didn't understand what was going on or what I was supposed to be doing. However, from there, I started learning about things that were coming out of the UN, and things that VR experiences that were more narrative driven. And to be honest with you, and I'm not saying this just because you guys are here, but Notes on Blindness was a remarkable piece. And it stuck with me. It's just the simplicity of storytelling and the use of the medium, right? And just the uniqueness of what VR can do. And when we were thinking about creative partners for On the Morning You Wake, and we talked to a lot of different creative partners to talk about like what their take would be and how we approach it. And the language that we, I think, came to is like we wanted something that was hauntingly beautiful, right? Not jarring, not so realism that you feel like, oh my God, like this is too much for me. And that's what I think was so beautifully achieved in Notes on Blindness.
There's no question. And it helped that it was Hawaii being threatened and not Dayton, Ohio. Pierre?
Well, I think it was an experience made by a studio in Montreal called Felix and Paul. And they did it was the first thing I ever saw in VR. It was a 360 film it was called Stranger, and it's this piano player rehearsing in his studio. It's just a long take, like 6 minutes, and it's just him playing piano. I think might be in New York in an apartment or something, and I was so moved just because I felt I was there. Like, this is where I was like, this is not film, this is something else. And it's just him, his dog is sleeping next to you.
Yeah.
And just looking at him playing, that's it. It was just so simple, so beautiful.
And what remains your favorite?
I think it's Carne Arena from Inaritu, actually the director of Bardo.
Yeah.
And Notes on Blindness. Both of them, they're quite different, but because Carne Arena is more of an installation, like you have to walk in. They take your shoes off, you walk in the sand. It's a like really different experience from being sitting and so that's those two.
Can I just shout out Goliath, which I think is an incredible VR experience, which sort of reflects on video games and mental health, the intersection between the two, the use of video games as therapy. And again, it's like, it's incredibly, just the approach to the story, I think, is something so fresh, but also the use of interaction. So there is a slight gamification, but only in a way that is emotionally and narratively satisfying as well. I hope it's a project that gets even further exposure. I know the Games Change continue to work with them as well, with the friends of ours from the UK. But that film that project has basically been absolutely clearing up the awards on the circuit, and rightly so. It's a brilliant meditation on mental health video games.
Well, we're going to wrap up and get questions from the audience, but final to you guys is just briefly, what haven't I asked and what would you like to say to people about this project?
I think you nailed it, to be honest.
Just because I've been working in this space, I knew nothing about nuclear weapons before I started on this project, but we've been working with subject matter experts, impact fellows, and they've been a huge collaborator on this project for us. Some of them are featured in the experience themselves. Some of them went through the experience themselves. Some of them had Nobel Peace Prizes. And it's been so inspiring to learn about the activists that are working against nuclear weapons, right? It's so easy to feel disheartened. It's so easy to feel like, wow, this is a mountain. But the reality is there's only 9 countries in the world that have and own and operate and produce nuclear weapons. And there are 2 treaties that illegally ban nuclear weapons from the face of the earth through the United Nations. And so the idea is if you can get 100 people in power in those countries to change their mind, you can eradicate the world of nuclear weapons. And something that's really powerful that Tamara told me, Lillinois Patton, who we've mentioned before, she said, the same people and technology that made nuclear weapons can be the same people and technology that eradicate and erase nuclear weapons from the world. And so that always sits with me as that's right. We created these things, we can uncreate them too. So that just to leave a sense of hope around this subject and around this issue that this piece is about.
Anything?
I'm super proud to work with these 2 guys. Just wanted to say that.
Yeah, we should call out Steve Jameson, who's in the audience. Yeah. Good wave, who's the other half of Arthur's Mark, and a co-writer and director.
And before I throw it out to the audience, I have been deeply immersed in the world of nuclear weapons for about 15 years now, and it's left me really concerned, but not apocalyptic. And like Michaela said, there are 9 countries that have nuclear weapons, and there are about 190 that don't. And there are entire continents that don't. And there's nothing inevitable about these things being used, but we have to be aware and then do something about it. Anyway, are there any questions? Yeah.
So I have, first of all, brilliant, fantastic piece. I saw it tonight, all three parts, and I just couldn't stop. I was amazed, and it was beautiful. Thank you. So I have first a comment and then a question. My comment is, I understood that the woman who was recounting Hiroshima was in some sense intended to be this sort of emotional centerpiece, like, oh my gosh, we're hearing that. But the thing that actually got to me was the man who, toward the end, made the call to enable the alert, because that was the one place where you actually had somebody going through a moral dilemma, and I was completely riveted by his experience. Everybody else was saying, we went through this, but this man was saying, I don't know, what are you supposed to do? And there was something about that I found was very powerful, and I think the way you filmed him in this very mysterious, shadowy way was...
It's played by Pierre Zandrovitz, if you don't mind. He was actually playing that character.
Great job.
Thank you.
I never suspected it. And then the other, so that's a comment about, I thought that was very powerful. But the question, I want you to comment on is, there is a tension formally in terms of the medium that I would love to hear your opinion about, which is, I was aware all the time, of course it's VR, I could look behind me and I could see all this beautiful Hawaii and the cities and there's cars and there's all these things, and yet you're telling a story, and I know I want to be focused on the characters, and if I turn my head around to look at the beautiful landscape, I will miss the story. So that's not something that happens in the proscenium of a movie. You know, we don't look behind us in a movie unless somebody's like chewing popcorn too loud. So what was your thought process in negotiating that tension?
It's a really great question. And look, I think if you're not thinking about those questions as someone making a VR project, you've got a problem. And I think obviously it's about the relationship between author and user. I think, we have things like points of interest, and they can be audio points of interest, visual points of interest. You kind of try and work within, I guess, 270 degrees ish, like you try not to put things behind you. But it's really interesting you say that as well, because I think the feeling that you might be missing something, or more that you might be led towards something, is part of the experience of you inhabiting that, of you being able to make mistakes, or the infinity of the world. It's not infinite, of course it's not infinite, but it feels like it's infinite, and it means that you inhabit that much more as you would everyday life. You have a different emotional hit. And I'd give the example actually of the storm drain scene with the kids that, again, I was speaking to a friend earlier about, and she was saying, how really moving and profound she felt it to be trapped in a storm drain with these children, with them coming towards you. We obviously increased the size of the kids as well for sort of effect as well. But as she said to me, well, if you watch it again and you look up, you will also see that we shot a separate insert of the parents actually having to push the cover of the drain over to actually say goodbye to their kids and cover them. And for me, the idea that there are other emotional pathways through a scene, the other ways of understanding the scene, or a richness to that scene, it is kind of what makes it so infinitely emotionally engaging, or not infinitely, more heightened and emotionally engaging than, say, a 2D film, I guess. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Back there.
Hi folks, thank you for your work in and outside of this piece. I'd love to hear thoughts about, as you're looking to the future, what are issues that you think are underrepresented in this medium that you might be excited to explore in the future?
Sorry, what issues?
Yes.
Oh, so many. Well, it's really hard to answer that. I don't really have an answer. Like, I guess, the thing is, with that project, what is amazing is, we were talking about the medium and the fact that suddenly you become by yourself in that situation. And of course, how you have to focus because you don't have your cell phone, you can't talk with people, and so yeah, I think it's a great medium to achieve, like to express any fight. So yeah, I think it could be anything. Like, it's really like theater. Like, I wouldn't. Yeah, maybe there's one thing. It would be I'm not sure I put it right, but it would be biases. When biases. Yeah, I think this is something that could be explored, like, because you don't really realize until you're in the shoes of someone how it feels like. Like, I've never been in the shoes of a woman, for example, or anyone else. So I think it would be really great to have something that could explore that, I guess.
Really quickly, because I think you've got the
Oh yeah,
I know you have a lot to say on this.
Oh my goodness. So first and foremost, Games for Change has an XR for Change program and initiative, and one of the biggest things that I always think about when we think about this program is not just about the topics and issues that we're exploring, but the creators that we're empowering. So I think at the minute you start empowering creators from a different lens, a different perspective, a global perspective, I think a big part of what we're doing with XR for Change is we're trying to activate creators in Africa, creators in South America, creators in the Asia Pacific. I think what's so cool and amazing about VR is that we can actually kind of redo the topics and issues that we already did in film and video games, but do it from an authentic voice, an authentic creative perspective. So it could be any issue, but for me, what I'm most excited about is to see the Filipino talk about their story living and growing up in the Philippines. The indigenous woman actually speaking out about her experience with abortion, or like someone who actually has schizophrenia being able to collaborate with a team of people in VR to create experiences about schizophrenia. And so I think it's like every issue, yes, but also like who we're putting behind the table to make those powers and decisions of how those stories are being presented and how those stories are being told, and making sure that we aren't just telling stories for a specific audience, but telling the stories authentic to the people who want their stories being told. Yeah.
That's really well said. Absolutely. I think we were told that we've already gone over time. I'm sorry, Eric.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.